Hello. In this video clip, I want to talk a little bit about the nature of arguments. One thing we do in logic is discuss certain properties of arguments. So to get a little bit more precise about our subject, it'd be helpful to get a little bit more precise about just what we mean when we speak of arguments. Now, an argument, as we'll think about it in philosophy and logic, is not the sort of thing that the gentlemen in this picture are doing. It's not the sort of thing that you may sometimes get into with your roommate or significant other that results in slammed doors and hurt feelings. Now, in philosophy and logic, when we speak of arguments, we're really speaking of attempts at rational persuasion. So in their comedy sketch, Argument Clinic, Monty Python actually gives us a very nice definition of what an argument is, in the sense in which we're talking about arguments. The definition they provide is that an argument is a connected series of statements intended to establish a definite proposition. And this definition of argument is pretty good as far as it goes, although one defect in it is this little word establish. The problem is that in philosophy, in politics, even in science, the purpose of an argument isn't to definitively establish some conclusion. Often the purpose of an argument is merely to lend some degree of rational support to a given conclusion. So this definition as it stands is a little bit too strong. So let's modify the definition a little bit. Here will be our official definition for the course. Our definition of an argument will be that an argument is a collection of premises intended to lend rational support to a given conclusion. Now, I have introduced in this definition the terminology of premises and conclusion, rather than, as in the Monty Python definition, statements and proposition. The reason that I've done that is because the terminology of premises and conclusion is rather standard, and it's the terminology that we'll be using in this course. So we're going to think of arguments as collections of premises followed by a conclusion, where the purpose of the premises is to lend some degree of rational support to the conclusion. We'll look at plenty of examples of arguments throughout this series of lectures. In the meantime, though, I'd like to note that there are, broadly speaking, two different kinds of arguments. So there are what we could call deductive arguments. Deductive arguments are arguments that aim to be such that their conclusion logically follows from their premises. There are also what we might call non-deductive arguments. Non-deductive arguments aim to be such that if their premises are true, then their conclusion is probably true. Now, this word aims that shows up in both definitions is quite important. You might have a deductive argument that fails to be such that its conclusion logically follows from its premises. Or you might have a non-deductive argument that fails to be such that if its premises are true, then its conclusion is probably true. But just because an argument, say, fails to be such that its conclusion logically follows from its premises, that doesn't entail that the argument is not a deductive argument. Or just because an argument fails to be such that if its premises are true, then its conclusion is probably true, that doesn't entail that it's not a non-deductive argument. Whether an argument counts as a deductive argument or a non-deductive argument has to do with what it aims to do, not with whether it succeeds in that aim. We can have examples of defective arguments, arguments that fail to achieve their aim. So be mindful of this. I might ask you on a quiz or a test, for example, whether it is the case that to be a deductive argument, an argument has to be such that its conclusion logically follows from its premises. If I ask you that question, I'll have asked you a trick question, and I'm letting you know in advance that I may ask you. such a trick question? The answer to that question is yes. A deductive argument can be such that its conclusion fails to logically follow from its premises. It can be that way because a deductive argument just has to have the aim of being such that its conclusion logically follows from its premises. And some deductive arguments, as we will see, fail in that aim. Now let's look at an example of a non-deductive argument. So, let me back up just a minute and note something that some of you may have had a question about. So, as I've divided the territory, I've divided it between deductive arguments and non-deductive arguments. Some of you may have heard of a similar distinction, but as you've heard of the distinction, it's a distinction between deductive arguments and inductive arguments. The reason that I haven't divided the territory that way, although that might be more familiar to some of you, is that as I see it, inductive arguments are a subclass or a subspecies of the non-deductive arguments. As I see it, there are some kinds of non-deductive arguments that are not inductive arguments. But this is just a technical point. And if you've never heard of the distinction between deductive and inductive arguments before, and what I've just said means nothing to you, then forget about it. But for those of you who have heard of the distinction, I just wanted to flag this issue and note why I am dividing things up between deductive arguments and non-deductive arguments, rather than between deductive arguments and inductive arguments. That being said, let's go ahead and look at an example of a non-deductive argument. This is, in fact, what some of you would recognize as an inductive argument, and it goes like this. Premise, and this argument will turn out to only have one premise. The sun has risen every morning for all of recorded human history. Conclusion, therefore the sun will rise tomorrow morning. Now note that the conclusion of this argument does not logically follow from the premise. It could be, for all that logic tells us, for example, that the Earth will be obliterated tonight by an asteroid, and so the sun will not rise tomorrow morning. In fact, logic by itself doesn't really tell us anything about the laws of nature or what kind of regularities will persist in the future. So for all logic tells us, it could be that the sun will just inexplicably disappear tonight, and for that reason fail to rise tomorrow morning. So the conclusion of this argument does not follow from its premise. It doesn't logically follow from its premise. Still, it's plausible at least that the conclusion is probably true given the premise. It's plausible that the premise offers us a good reason to believe that the conclusion is true, that it makes the conclusion probable. So even though this argument would fail as a deductive argument, it would fail because the conclusion doesn't logically follow from the premise, this argument's still a pretty decent argument. It's an example of a good non-deductive argument. Now, we could spend a whole course trying to figure out what makes for good non-deductive arguments, but we're not going to do that. The focus of this course is going to be on deductive arguments, and we won't concern ourselves with non-deductive arguments at all. So I wanted to mention this division between deductive arguments and non-deductive arguments, and I wanted to give you an example of a non-deductive argument, only to set non-deductive arguments aside. In this course, we will be entirely focused on deductive arguments. What's an example of a deductive argument? Here's a fairly classic example of one that you may have seen before, and it goes like this. All humans are mortal. That's the first premise. Second premise, Socrates is human. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now note that the conclusion of this argument logically follows from its premises. Intuitively, you can see that that is true. Now there's a question, can we get a little bit more precise about what we mean when we say that the conclusion of a deductive argument, of a good deductive argument, logically follows from its premises? And the answer is that we can get more precise about that, and that is the topic of the lecture found in the next video clip.